This is a story of my 1982 Mustang GT with T-tops, which I've nicknamed the Rodder. The story of the Rodder starts back in 2007 when this car came up for sale locally to me. At the time, I wasn't actually looking for another project, and I probably should have just passed on it, but I've always wanted an 82 Mustang GT. And since this one was equipped with T-tops, it really piqued my interest. I also assumed that if I had not rescued this car, in air quotes, it likely would have ended up in a junkyard and ultimately crushed. The Rodder was basically just a shell when I got it. The car was missing the drivetrain and most of the interior. I knew this was going to be a long-term project, and I did spend many hours tracking down missing parts and replacement sheet metal panels. The Rodder sat on and off my car trailer for about 4 years, where a few other projects kept pushing this one to the back burner. Finally, in September of 2011, I started working on the project. First task was to strip it down and give it a full wash. The car was stripped down to basically a bare shell. I even removed the entire dash as well as most of the wiring harnesses. The car spent a bunch of time out on Cape Cod. Winters and ocean air had taken their toll on much of the body. Even so, the bones of the chassis were in reasonably good shape. However, I knew much of the body panels would need replacement, including the doors, hood, front fender, rear hatch, quarter panels, etc. There was even rot at both the A and C pillars that needed repair and replacement. Even parts of the frame rails under the battery tray needed attention. The first major project to attack were the floors. The rear portion of the driver's floor pan was already cut out by a previous owner, and the passenger floor was soft thanks to years of leaky T-tops. After removing the inside cross member, I replaced both sides with new aftermarket floor pans. Subframe connectors were also added to help keep the car solid. Once the floors were solid, next up was the engine bay. There was also some minimal rust damage to the lower sections of the cowl. These spots were also cut out and replaced with fresh metal and sealed to prevent future rust. The front frame rails were rebuilt, cutting out all the weak/rotted areas. The engine bay was then thoroughly cleaned, sanded, primered, and finally painted with single-stage acrylic enamel in the original color code, code 24, which is medium red. Once the engine bay was painted, it was reassembled with the wiring harnesses, master brake booster, lines, etc. Years prior to this time, I was able to source a used and rebuilt engine and transmission out of an 82 Capri RS. This included the original S-Rod 4-speed manual trans. This engine was cleaned up and painted in original Ford gray, then installed into the freshly painted engine bay. The remainder of the drivetrain was installed, hooked up. I spent a bunch of time under the car cleaning up the remainder of the floorboards. Next up was to reinstall the dash and associated wiring so that I could start the engine. I purchased the engine on faith from the seller, and I wanted to run it for a bit to ensure that the engine I bought didn't have any major issues. Everything went as expected, and the 5.0 ran flawlessly. This was about October of 2012, just about a year after pushing the car into the garage. Now that the floors and engine bay were in good shape, I turned my attention to the main body panels. I started on the rear quarter panel, cutting out all of the rusty and rotted areas. I was able to save most of this quarter panel. Patch panels were fabbed from sheet metal, as well as using old fenders for the more complex areas that needed repair. The driver's side quarter panel was in worse shape, so I opted to replace the outer sheet metal with a repop panel. After removing the outer panel skin, I needed to repair and replace metal on the inner wheel well. Again, I sourced metal from old fenders to speed up this repair process. Once the inner metal was repaired and coated for rust prevention, the new skin was trimmed and welded onto the car. Staying with the driver's side, the original front fender was sanded down, dents and dings were repaired. Replacement driver's side door was sourced from an Aero-era Mustang. However, even this door had rust issues around the door handle and at the lower door edge. These areas were replaced with new metal. There were several other areas of the Aero door that needed to be modified to be compatible with the 82 T-top, including adding the T-top specific structural supports. Once all the repairs were completed, the driver's door was sprayed in primer. Next up was back to the passenger side. Thankfully, the replacement passenger door was rust-free, so it was quick work to adapt the T-top specific supports to this door. The original fender was replaced with a good used fender originally from a 79 pace car. Both panels were sanded down, smoothed out, and primered. The rear hatch was also replaced, again from a different 79 pace car. I was lucky to find a replacement hatch that had the third wiper, much like my original hatch did. At this point, much of the driver and passenger panels were in pretty good shape. I ended up removing the original front windshield to attack the driver's side A-pillar rot. The more I dug, the worse it got. After finally removing all the bad metal, I started the tedious process to rebuild 3 layers of metal needed to repair the A-pillar. It may not look pretty prior to filler, but it's definitely structurally solid. By a stroke of luck, I was able to source a good new old stock hood in November of 2013. I actually drove to Binghamton, New York to pick it up from the seller. However, what I didn't realize is that the NOS hood wasn't the same as the original 82 hood. The latch point was shorter by about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. No problem, cut, weld, grind, a common theme on this project. C-pillars are next. Both were just starting to show signs of bubbling through the paint, but once I started to open up both areas, the rot damage was evident. All the original factory leaded seams were removed, cut, weld, grind, and skim coat of filler smoothed out these C-pillars. I did ensure that all the areas were thoroughly cleaned and treated to ensure no further issues. At this point, I also took care of the roof panels to strip off all the old paint and put them in primer. The next area that needed attention was the front bumper covers. The upper bumper cover was in good condition, only needing to be sanded down. The lower air dam was in sad shape with rips on both sides of the main opening. And based on the fact that the lower air dam had silver paint under the red, this wasn't the first time somebody had worked on the lower air dam of this car. The damaged areas were prepped and filled with a specific 2-part epoxy that stays flexible. Once the lower air dam was repaired, it was remounted on the car and the upper bumper cover was reinstalled. The next issue I found is that the 79 hatch is ever so slightly different from later 82 hatches. I'm not exactly sure the cutover, but in any case I ended up modifying the 79 hatch latch mounting area by grafting in the 82 metal. Cut, weld, grind, rinse, repeat. The rear bumper needed attention. The metal support bracket was, yep, you guessed it, rotted. So we repaired it with a galvanized angle steel. I also bought a foam support pad that fits between the steel bumper support and the bumper cover to avoid sags in the cover. This allowed the rear bumper cover to be installed and sanded down. I also spent some time sanding down the 3-piece rear spoilers to prep them for paint. Now we're finally ready for paint. First up are the door jambs and inner door frames. Sanded, primered, and finally sprayed 3 coats of medium red paint. I also took care of the underside of the hatch as well as the hatch jamb. Last step for pre-paint prep was the underside of the hood, sanded, primered, and finally painted. Now that the car is completely jammed, I went through the process to mask the entire car to protect all the newly painted areas. And that's where this video ends. Stay tuned for part 2 of the rotter.